Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to the Washington Policy Pulse. I'm Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst here in Washington, D.C. with Bloomberg Intelligence. Joining me on the call is Dwayne Wright. He's our senior healthcare analyst, also located here in Washington. And what Dwayne and I are going to do today is we're going to preview I was going to say the DNC convention. We're going to preview the presidential election for tomorrow night. Now, tomorrow night, 9 o'clock Eastern, held in the city of Philadelphia. This is going to be a debate, obviously, between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. The debate is going to be very similar in style to what we saw during the first debate between President Trump and President Biden. There are not going to be any microphones on. The microphones will be muted when that candidate is not talking. It's going to be in front of an empty audience. No notes will be allowed. They won't be allowed to address each other. So they will be very similar debate style to what we saw in the first debate. Now, there's going to be a lot of talk about, with the race being essentially tied as it is. And I was just looking at the Bloomberg polling that's found at WSL election. Predicted still has Kamala Harris up by a couple points. The Polymarket numbers have it essentially tied. Anybody's been watching the Nate Silver pieces, that President Trump has the advantage there. So this is essentially our weighing that things are still essentially tied, and we don't know, which is why the debate is going to be a key catalyst. Now, let's talk a little bit about the economic, the tax, the sector impacts that we think can come from this debate. Because, this debate's going to have a lot of different information on it. I think Kamala Harris is going to talk about reproductive rights. President Trump will talk about immigration and border security and so forth like that. But for the purposes of our call and the purposes of what we do, we think it really comes down to four key areas. The first one is tariffs. President Trump has obviously talked a lot about tariffs. Kamala Harris, as a part of President Biden's administration, has also been somewhat pro on tariffs on this targeted area. For those of you who follow U.S. Steel, know that the reporting from last week that President Biden, after he gets the CFIUS review, will sometime supposedly is going to block the U.S. Steel takeover. So you get this idea of tariffs are somewhat popular on both sides of the party. The question that we have is what ultimately is going to be the size of the tariff, and then also are there going to be broad tariffs like in President Trump's case, or are there going to be more targeted tariffs like in what we saw in President Biden's case? So we certainly think tariffs will come up. And I would also just remember for everything that we've talked about in previous calls, when it comes to tariffs, the power of the presidency is a lot more powerful there. Congress has delegated a lot of authority to tariffs to the presidency. So if you hear the tariff discussion tomorrow night, that's certainly something when you look at your how is this going to be implemented card, certainly keep this in mind that it's a lot more easier for a president to implement tariffs than it will be for other things that we're going to talk about later on the call. So that's the first thing. Second thing is we're going to talk about is taxes. Now, our analyst, Andrew Silverman, has done a lot of work on this case. So you're going to hear a lot of tax discussions, such as raising the corporate tax rate to 28% or lowering it to 15% in the case of first Kamala Harris and the second Donald Trump. You're going to hear a little bit more about child tax credits. Kamala Harris has proposed a $6,000 ones. Senator J.D. Vance floated a $5,000 tax credit for the child tax credit. You're also going to hear a little bit more about tax credits for VEVs, probably for small businesses. This is something that we've seen coming out of the Harris campaign recently, is this focus on tax credits for small businesses. And as I've said before, and you'll probably hear me say this multiple times between now and the election, 2025 is certainly going to be a tax reform or a tax debate year, so to speak. And just remember, though, anytime you hear the candidates say tomorrow night taxes, then put on your how is this going to work in Washington hat. And what you're going to see here is that just remember, when it comes to tax reform, Congress is an equal player when it comes to tax reform. And also the makeup of tax reform, or the Congress, is going to be extremely important. What I mean by here is that if President Trump has a good night and the Republicans take the House and the Senate, they can then use reconciliation to do a lot of these tax credits. If the Democrats take the House and President Trump wins, it's going to be more nuanced. And remember, tax policy historically starts with the chairman or the chairwoman of the House Ways and Means Committee. So I would always just caution that, candidates like to say certain things on the campaign trail, and I certainly don't want to say that they can't do it, but there's another equal party at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue that is also going to say we need to be somewhat important to that tax debate. For example, when I was talking to Andrew about this over the weekend, we've heard House Republicans say that they're not somewhat on board with going down to 15%, just because you're going to have to figure out how to pay for it somehow. And subsequently, we've also heard House Democrats say, 28% is somewhat high for a corporate tax rate. Maybe it's 22, 23. 2023, it's the current 21%. We've seen capital gains tax come into the discussion. So always just remember, when it comes to taxes, the makeup of Congress is extremely important because Congress is going to be an equal player in that. So I'm going to turn over to Dwayne now. Dwayne, just for the healthcare purposes and for what you're seeing in the debate, what can you tell us that you think are the key things to keep in mind for?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. So I think what we could end up with is a conversation along a couple of different fault lines. Number one is Harris being very proactive in pushing the Affordable Care Act once again, making the case that former President Trump tried to repeal the law. He will try to do it again and will likely frame the challenges with ending the enhanced subsidies with expire at the end of 2025. Former President Trump hasn't yet signaled, or at least has gone back and forth on this. He did try to repeal it. He had some comments early in the campaign that he wanted to repeal the law, and is now pretty much not saying that, but says he wants to make it better, though not really providing an indication as to what better means. Better for whom? The government, the taxpayer, better for the individual that's in the exchanges. And so I fully expect her, Vice President Harris, to really drive home this theme with President Trump basically saying, no, I don't want to repeal it. What his plans are, I doubt he'll try to clarify tomorrow night. I also expect the former president to bring up the Biden-Harris administration Medicare cuts. And this is really an in-the-weeds discussion about what the administration has done with the Medicare Advantage program. This is where seniors can opt to buy into a private healthcare plan like United Health and Humana and CVS. What the administration did last year in 2024 is recalculate or change the methodology into how payment rates are calculated. And as a result of that change, we saw cuts in 2024. We saw cuts this year, or it will be cuts for 2025, and probably 2026 again. And this is happening as the administration, or as the broader environment in terms of healthcare utilization has kind of surprised health plans. So they may have priced their products pretty aggressively to drive membership, but that new membership is also leading to higher costs. So we're seeing a bit of a moving of the chairs on the deck a bit. So the administration, former President Trump, is basically saying these have been cuts to Medicare and it's leading to fewer options for seniors. And we'll know more in October when Medicare Advantage marketing begins. I think the final area is on drug pricing. The candidate Harris will tout the Biden administration's negotiation prices, which aren't that deep. When you look at some of the net prices, they are billed as pretty deep cuts based on the list prices. The fully expect Harris to basically say we can do more. We should bring in more drugs for price cuts. It's pretty unclear what the the former president's going to do in terms of his commentary. He once supported negotiation. He opposed it as president. He did try to pass a regulatory rule to tie U.S. prices for some drugs to those overseas. And he's re-upped that again as part of the campaign, but hasn't signaled he wants to repeal the negotiation bill. So it's quite possible he could say, look, I can drive a better deal. We're still paying more than we should. And that's, of course, not good news for drug makers. So on the one hand, if you're a drug maker, you're looking at Vice President Harris saying she wants to bring in more drugs, and you might hear President Trump say, well, I can get better cuts. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out on the drug pricing front. That's my expectation as we look at healthcare.
Great. Thanks, Dwayne. And so, the last thing on the debate I would just say is that, we have seen some chatter, and this just goes into our overall theme with Vice President Kamala Harris, that she is going to want to be seen on potentially tougher on consumer-facing industries. And so if you go back to her speech from a couple of weeks ago, she talked a lot about price gouging and trying to tackle price gouging. I wouldn't be surprised if you were to see that again. And Holly Fromm, our analyst who's been looking at the consumer side, has a note out there essentially that if you look at the price gouging rhetoric that's coming out of the Harris campaign, it's not a lot of risk for those big grocers like Walmart and Kroger and Albertsons and so forth like that. So I just wanted to give that last thing. But ultimately, this probably won't be a policy debate. I think out of those 90 minutes, all that we just talked about could probably be about 5 to maybe 10 minutes of it. The rest just being, this general vision for America. So, but we're going to be following up on this. So if there's anything important that happens, certainly reach out to us afterwards. We'll be putting our thoughts on onto the terminal as well. So the next thing I just want to briefly talk about is the prospects of a government shutdown. Dwayne had a note out from last week on this. So Dwayne, question for you. Are we going to shut the government down by September 30th?
September, the best part of the year, well, sort of. Summer's over, so that's the bad part. But it's the will they or won't they shut down. It's an election year, so I'm very skeptical that this is going to go over the cliff. I think with House Republicans in charge of Congress, the likelihood of that happening, especially when there could be ramifications politically at the top of the ticket and even down ballot, are low. Now, I think this is where we look at the headlines and kind of be skeptical of anything that says we're heading towards a shutdown. So as it is usually the case, we're going to see proposals that are mainly designed to appeal to a certain wing of the party. And we're seeing that now with not just extending funding for the federal government through March, but attaching some other favorite provisions, whether it's related to immigration or voting and election integrity. I expect that to play out, and then typically the Democratic response will be, yeah, that's a non-starter. And even some Republicans will say, let's just see what we can do, punt it to December, and then figure out a path forward. So I think there'll be a lot of headline noise about the government getting shut down. But as we get to that final week, we'll probably see some kind of deal that, which is typical for an election year, where everything gets punted to the past Thanksgiving, and there's a broader conversation of, okay, now that it's December, we have all these other priorities and some healthcare and other provisions that expire at the end of the year. How do we move forward and keep the lights on? So again, don't be surprised by the headline noise, but be skeptical that we're actually heading to a shutdown.
Yeah, and, from the market impact, obviously, from the shutdowns, there's really not much there. I mean, even if you go back to the 30-plus day shutdown that came in during the Trump administration, our chief equity market strategist, Gina Martin-Adams, and I have a note that's out on the terminal. It essentially just shows that, even though the markets did decline at the beginning of that shutdown, by the end of that shutdown, markets had actually gone up. And even we always struggle to even find something in terms of contractors that are impacted, because defense contractors have such long contracts and leeways and so forth like that, that usually a 10-day shutdown. But apologize if there's a contractor who's watching this right now who would get furloughed, but we fortunately don't think that's going to happen. Last thing I want to talk about, just some upcoming dates. Tomorrow is a big one for those of you in the banking sector. Vice Chairman Michael Barr at the Fed is going to be speaking at Brookings at 10 a.m. That's going to be live online, so if you need to watch, just go to the Brookings website. They are going to be previewing changes to the Basel III Endgame. Now, Bloomberg News reported over the weekend that potentially on September 19th, a 400-plus page reproposal of the proposal will be coming out. And so I think tomorrow we'll probably get a better idea of how Vice Chairman Barr is thinking about that. Will they incorporate additional changes to make it a little bit more less burdensome on the banks? Remember, for the GSIBs, the original proposal was a 19% increase. We estimate around a 7 to 10% increase ultimately, but again, that will change based off of the proposal. And then finally, the House Financial Services Committee, some of the subcommittees are doing some work this week. Digital assets, ESG, ESG and so forth. But for next week, the House Financial Services is going to have a lot more hearings on crypto. For example, Chairman SEC Chairman Gary Gensler is going to be there, not just about crypto, but in just general. And then lastly, you're going to see a lot of votes this week in the House on China Week. This is a lot of China legislation. There's actually four that are going to be up for debate, four or five. I think it's four or five. They're going to be up for debate. So if you have interest in China or any exposure to China, certainly something to pay attention to. But with that, I'm going to say thank you. I apologize we ran a couple minutes long, but again, it's a lot of stuff happening, but we really appreciate you logging on. And if we can ever be of service, please don't hesitate to let us know. Thanks.